Good afternoon, I'm Liz Reyes.
And I'm John Snell. A federal indictment handed up today in federal court details former officer Jeffrey Vappie's alleged relationship with Mayor Cantrell.
It also details the actions Vappie's allegedly took as news reports began to expose their time together. Megata reports.
From Googling the name of the bodyguard in the Whitney Houston movie to searching for the home address of Lee Zurich, who aired stories about Jeffrey Vappie, the federal indictment handed up today uncovers new details about the former member of Mayor Cantrell's executive protection team. The federal government alleges Vappie carried on a personal romantic relationship with public official 1, described as the mayor of the city of New Orleans, and then attempted to disguise their interactions to make it appear they were related to his duties. The federal indictment lays bare the connection between the protector and his protectee. It laid out several examples, like 14 trips across the country and the world that allegedly cost taxpayers $47,000 just for Vappie's expenses. It also revealed romantic messages and photos exchanged between the two that were later deleted. The indictment says in March of last year, after news reports about Vappie and Cantrell aired, Vappie conducted multiple online searches about Lee Zurich's home address. About 2 months later, Vappie had a disciplinary hearing about his NOPD time cards while he served on the executive protection team. Lee Zurich's outside the office reports exposed how Vappie spent time both on and off the clock holed up inside the city-owned Upper Pontalba apartment with Mayor Cantrell. After his disciplinary hearing, at which Vappie received letters of reprimand, Vappie is accused of trying to influence the then interim superintendent, Michelle Woodfork, into exonerating him by telling Woodfork this was her, quote, opportunity to make it right, when she reviewed the file and had to make a decision about whether to censure Vappie. In September of that year, the indictment says Vappie was there when Public Official 1 told the interim superintendent that Public Official 1 would not nominate the interim superintendent to serve as the permanent chief of NOPD. Vappie then allegedly contacted Woodfork after that meeting and invited her to a daiquiri shop to discuss her recent demotion and try to mitigate her disappointment. We reached out to Michelle Woodfork, but she refused to comment. The indictment also accuses Vappie of lying to FBI agents when they visited his home in July of 2023. Vappie denied having a physical or romantic relationship with Public Official 1, yet agents found voice messages in which Vappie and Public Official 1 expressed their love and affection for each other. And the indictment even included a picture of this note Vappie and Public Official 1 allegedly exchanged. Vappie is accused in the indictment of receiving more than $7,000 in salary for times the federal government alleged he submitted false and fraudulent time cards, spending time inside the Pontalba or on trips instead of working.